The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, the kind of gray, unremarkable day that carried no warning of change. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen counter, still wearing the work uniform from her overnight shift at the diner, her fingers tracing the embossed letterhead of a law firm she'd never heard of. The paper felt expensive, official, in a way that made her immediately uneasy. Letters like this never brought good news, not to people like her. She read it 3 times before the words stopped feeling like a mistake. An inheritance. From an uncle she barely remembered, a man whose face existed only in faded photographs tucked somewhere in her mother's old albums. Thomas Whitmore. The name surfaced slowly from childhood memories, a distant relative who'd sent cards at Christmas with $5 bills tucked inside, who'd stopped visiting after her mother's funeral when Sarah was barely 12. The property in question was described in cold legal terms, a former industrial site, specifically a paper manufacturing facility, located 40 miles north in the town of Riverside Mills. The letter mentioned the structure's condition with careful language: significant deterioration, environmental concerns, no current utilities, market value estimated at the cost of demolition. Sarah set the letter down and stared at her reflection in the kitchen window. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of too many double shifts and too little sleep. Her daughter Emma's backpack sat by the door, patched with duct tape where the zipper had given out. On the refrigerator, 3 past-due notices were held in place by magnets shaped like smiling suns, their cheerful yellow faces a cruel contrast to the red ink beneath them. She picked up her phone and called the number at the bottom of the letter. The attorney who answered spoke with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to confused beneficiaries. Yes, the inheritance was legitimate. No, there were no monetary assets, only the property itself. Yes, she could decline it, though there would be some paperwork. The tax burden, he mentioned almost as an afterthought, would need to be addressed whether she accepted or not. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of walls closing in that had become her constant companion over the past 2 years, since Marcus left. Since the diagnosis that came with bills her insurance barely touched. Since her world had narrowed to a series of impossible calculations, balancing rent against groceries, electricity against Emma's school supplies, hope against the grinding reality of never having enough. She thanked the attorney and ended the call. Through the thin walls of the apartment, she could hear her neighbor's television, the muffled laugh track of a morning show. Emma was still asleep, having crawled into Sarah's bed sometime after midnight, following another nightmare. At 6 years old, she understood more than Sarah wanted her to. She'd stopped asking for things. That awareness, that premature resignation, hurt worse than any bill. The factory. Sarah turned the words over in her mind. A building no one wanted, in a town she'd never been to, left behind by a man who disappeared from her life before she'd learned to spell his name. The logical choice was obvious. Sign the papers. Walk away. Let someone else deal with whatever problems the place held. She had enough of her own. But logic had stopped being her guide a long time ago. Logic would have told her to give up months ago, to declare bankruptcy, to accept her sister's offer to move 3 states away and start over working retail in a mall food court. Logic made sense only when you had options. Sarah had learned to recognize opportunity in strange packages, to see value where others saw only burden. She spent the rest of the morning on her laptop, searching for information about Riverside Mills and the Whitmore Paper Company. What she found painted a picture of slow industrial death. The factory had closed in 1987, part of a wave of shutdowns that had gutted manufacturing towns across the region. The building had stood empty since then, changing hands several times through bank seizures and failed redevelopment schemes. Each new owner had apparently taken one look at the scale of work required and walked away. The photographs she found online were dated, but telling. A massive brick structure, 4 stories tall, with rows of broken windows that stared out like vacant eyes. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern wing. Weeds grew thick around the foundation, reclaiming asphalt that had fractured into geometric chaos. Chain-link fencing surrounded the property, bent and rusted. More suggestion than barrier. Sarah zoomed in on one image, trying to see past the decay to whatever had once made this place valuable. Her uncle had worked there. She remembered that much now. Some kind of manager or foreman? He'd been proud of it, she thought, though the memory was fragile. Easily confused with wishful thinking. Emma emerged from the bedroom just after noon, her hair tangled, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been her comfort since she was 2. "Mama, I'm hungry." Sarah closed the laptop and moved to the kitchen, assembling a lunch from what remained in the refrigerator. Peanut butter sandwich, apple slices from fruit that was starting to brown, a handful of crackers. She watched Emma eat, noting how carefully her daughter rationed each bite, making it last. No child should eat like that, with such practiced conservation. No child should have learned that skill at 6. "Baby, how would you feel about taking a drive this weekend? Just you and me?" Emma looked up, a flicker of excitement quickly dampened by caution. "Where?" "To see a building. An old factory that used to belong to someone in our family." "Is it fun?" Sarah smiled despite herself. "Probably not. But it's ours, and I need to decide what to do about it." That afternoon, after Emma was settled with coloring books at a neighbor's apartment, Sarah made the calls she'd been avoiding. Her landlord first, negotiating another extension on rent that was already 3 weeks late. Then the hospital billing department, asking about payment plans that would stretch her daughter's medical debt across more months than seemed possible. Finally, her boss at the diner, requesting 3 days off she hadn't earned and couldn't afford. Each conversation chipped away at her pride, forcing her to speak words that tasted like failure. "Please, I understand. I'm trying." The responses varied, but the underlying message was always the same. Time was running out. Patience had limits. Soon, very soon, the fragile structure she'd built from compromises and promises would collapse. That night, alone after Emma had finally fallen asleep, Sarah returned to her laptop and pulled up the property tax records for the factory. The numbers made her stomach clench. Even abandoned, the building carried an annual tax burden that exceeded her monthly income. The arrears had piled up over years of neglect, penalties accumulating like snowdrifts against a door no one had bothered to open. Accepting the inheritance meant accepting that debt. It meant adding another impossible obligation to a life already drowning in them. Sarah should have laughed at the absurdity of it. Instead, she found herself calculating. If she could somehow clear the tax debt, if there was any salvageable value in the building itself, if she could find a buyer willing to take on a renovation project, maybe, possibly, there might be enough to make a difference. Not a fortune. Just enough breathing room to see past the next crisis. It was a desperate thought, the kind of magical thinking she'd trained herself to avoid. But desperation had become her default state, and magical thinking was sometimes the only kind available when logic offered nothing but surrender. She printed out the attorney's letter and the tax documents, filing them in the folder she kept for important papers. Most of the folder's contents were bills and denial letters, but tucked in the back was Emma's birth certificate and a photograph of Sarah's mother, smiling in front of a garden that no longer existed. She added the factory papers to that small collection of things worth keeping, though she couldn't have explained why. Friday arrived with the weight of deadline anxiety. Sarah's shift at the diner stretched across 14 hours, her feet aching in shoes that should have been replaced months ago. She smiled at customers, refilled coffee, cleared plates, and counted tips that never quite added up to enough. During her break, she sat in her car and ate a cold sandwich while researching demolition contractors and scrap metal buyers, trying to understand what, if anything, an abandoned factory might yield. The information was discouraging. Asbestos remediation costs, environmental assessments, structural hazards, liability insurance. Every article she read mentioned expenses that far exceeded any potential return. Old industrial buildings were liabilities, not assets. The smart money walked away. But Sarah had no smart money. She had a rusted-out sedan, $300 in a savings account that hemorrhaged with every emergency, and an inheritance that consisted of a problem she couldn't afford and couldn't ignore. On Saturday morning, she packed Emma into the car along with snacks, water, and enough activities to occupy a restless 6-year-old for several hours. The drive to Riverside Mills took them through landscape that grew progressively more worn. Thriving suburbs gave way to tired towns with boarded storefronts and faded signs advertising businesses that no longer existed. Emma pressed her face against the window, pointing out horses in a field, a red barn, a truck carrying logs. Sarah tried to see the journey through her daughter's eyes, as an adventure rather than an investigation into futility. When they finally crossed into Riverside Mills, even Emma's commentary quieted. The town center looked like it was dissolving in slow motion. A main street lined with empty buildings, their brick facades crumbling into piles of red dust on cracked sidewalks. A few businesses remained open, a hardware store with dim lighting, a diner that made Sarah's workplace look upscale, a gas station where 2 men sat outside in lawn chairs, watching their car pass with expressions that held neither welcome nor hostility, only the flat assessment of strangers judging other strangers. The factory sat on the outskirts, visible from a quarter-mile away. As Sarah turned down the access road, the full scale of it emerged from behind a line of overgrown trees. It was larger than the photographs had suggested, sprawling across several acres, with architectural features that spoke of an era when industry was built to project permanence. Ornate brickwork framed the main entrance. A tower rose from the center, probably once used for water storage, now listing slightly to one side. She parked outside the fence and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, staring at what she'd inherited. Calling it destroyed was generous. The building looked like it was being slowly consumed by nature and time, its boundaries between structure and landscape blurring as walls crumbled and vegetation crept through every opening. "Mama, is this it?" Emma's voice was small, uncertain. "This is it." "Baby." It looked sad. Sarah felt something catch in her throat. "Yeah, it does." They got out of the car, and Sarah approached the fence, looking for the access gate mentioned in the attorney's paperwork. She found it padlocked, the chain newer than everything else, probably installed by whatever local authority had taken minimal steps to secure the property. The combination the attorney had provided worked on the first try, and the lock fell open with a solid click that seemed too loud in the surrounding quiet. The gate scraped across broken pavement as Sarah pushed it open. She turned to Emma, who had stopped several feet back, her rabbit clutched tight against her chest. "Stay close to me, okay? And don't touch anything." They walked across what had once been a parking lot, now fractured into abstract patterns by roots and frost heave. Grass grew in thick clumps through the cracks, and small trees had established themselves in corners where soil had accumulated. The main entrance to the factory loomed ahead, its heavy metal doors secured with chains that looked less official than the gate lock had been. Sarah moved along the building's perimeter, looking for another way in. The windows on the ground floor were too high to reach, and most were either boarded over or blocked by steel grating. She was about to give up and call the attorney about access when Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, look!" Around the corner, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, was a smaller door. The wood had rotted near the bottom, and someone, at some point, had kicked in the lower panels. Sarah crouched and peered through the gap. Darkness beyond, thick and complete. She pulled out her phone and activated the flashlight, aiming the beam through the opening. Concrete floor, empty space, no immediate hazards visible. She looked at Emma, weighing risks. Bringing her daughter into an unstable building violated every instinct she had, but leaving her outside, alone, felt equally wrong. "We're just going to look around for a few minutes, okay? If anything seems dangerous, we leave right away." Emma nodded, her trust absolute and terrifying. Sarah worked at the damaged door until she'd created an opening large enough to squeeze through. The smell hit her first, damp and chemical, overlaid with decades of decay. She helped Emma through, then stood in what appeared to be a loading area, sweeping her phone's light across the space. The factory's interior was a cathedral of industrial abandonment. Ceiling beams soared overhead, many sagging with water damage, some broken entirely, and hanging at angles that defied immediate collapse. The concrete floor was littered with debris, broken equipment, scattered papers that had faded to uniform gray. Graffiti covered accessible walls, layers of spray paint, creating a palimpsest of trespassers who'd come and gone over the years. They moved carefully, Sarah keeping Emma close, avoiding areas where the floor looked unstable. The main production floor opened before them, vast and empty. This was where paper had been made, she assumed, though all the machinery had been removed, leaving only bolt patterns in the concrete and discolored rectangles where equipment had once stood. Pigeons fluttered in the upper reaches, disturbed by the intrusion. Their wings beat against air that hung heavy with moisture and abandonment. Sunlight penetrated through holes in the roof, creating dramatic shafts that illuminated floating dust and gave the space an almost sacred quality, a church of failed enterprise. Emma stayed quiet, sensing perhaps that this wasn't a place for her usual questions. She kept her hand in Sarah's, her steps synchronized with her mother's, trusting without understanding. They climbed a metal staircase to the second floor, testing each step before committing weight. The stairs held, though they groaned in protest. Up here, offices lined one wall, their doors hanging open or missing entirely. Sarah glanced into each one, finding remnants of clerical work. Filing cabinets tipped over, their contents spilled and water damaged beyond legibility. Desks reduced to metal frames, their wooden components long since rotted or stolen. A calendar on one wall, frozen at October 1987, the last month anyone had cared enough to turn the page. In what must have been the manager's office, larger than the others, with windows overlooking the production floor, Sarah found a nameplate on the floor. Thomas Whitmore, production director. She picked it up, brushing away dirt, and felt the weight of connection to a man she'd never really known. He'd sat here, looked out these windows, made decisions about things that had once mattered. Now it was all gone, reduced to debris and pigeons, and the creeping certainty that whatever value this place had held had evaporated decades ago. She pocketed the nameplate anyway, a small theft from her own inheritance. They continued exploring, moving through the third floor, where more production equipment had once lived, leaving behind only industrial skeletons. Emma found a bird's nest in a corner, its construction intricate and abandoned. Sarah photographed it with her phone, though she wasn't sure why. Perhaps as evidence that life found ways to continue even in places designed for other purposes. The fourth floor was the most damaged. Here, the roof collapse had been extensive, leaving large sections open to the sky. Rain had poured through for years, creating miniature ecosystems of moss and small plants growing on beams and in corners where soil had accumulated. It was beautiful in a way that made Sarah's chest ache, this demonstration of nature's patient reclamation. "Mama, can we go home now?" Emma's voice was tired, slightly whiny in the way that signaled approaching limits. "Soon, baby. Let me just check one more thing." Sarah had noticed, during their exploration, that the building's footprint didn't quite match what they'd walked through. The exterior suggested more depth than the interior revealed. She'd seen similar architectural quirks in old buildings before, spaces enclosed for mechanical systems or storage that weren't obvious from casual inspection. Back on the first floor, she searched the perimeter walls more carefully, looking for doors or passages they'd missed. In a corner, half hidden by a collapsed section of mezzanine, she found it. A metal door, painted the same industrial gray as the walls, easy to overlook. Unlike most of the building's features, this door was intact, even its hinges relatively free of rust. She tried the handle. Locked. But the lock was old, simple, the kind that had probably opened with a generic key decades ago. Sarah looked around and found a piece of metal rebar among the debris. She worked it into the gap between door and frame, applying careful pressure. The wood around the lock plate was soft with rot, and after several attempts, something gave with a dry crack. The door swung inward, revealing stairs descending into darkness, more complete than anything they'd encountered so far. Cold air exhaled from below, carrying a smell distinctly different from the rest of the building. Less organic, more metallic, definitely drier. Sarah aimed her phone light down the stairs, but the beam didn't penetrate far. The walls were concrete, solid, and intact, suggesting this space had been built with more permanence than the wood and brick above. She felt a flutter of something in her chest, not quite hope, but curiosity's close cousin. "Baby, I need you to wait here for just a minute while I check downstairs, okay?" Emma's eyes went wide. "No, Mama, I want to stay with you." Sarah hesitated. Every responsible instinct said to leave, to come back another time with proper equipment, and preferably another adult. But another time meant more money, more logistics, more obstacles between her and understanding what, if anything, her inheritance actually contained. She compromised. "Okay, but you hold my hand the entire time, and if I say we leave immediately. Promise?" "Promise." They descended together, one slow step at a time. The staircase was steep, industrial, built for function rather than comfort. Sarah counted 15 steps before they reached the bottom and found themselves in a corridor. Unlike the chaos above, this space showed signs of intentional design. The floor was poured concrete, smooth and level. The walls were reinforced, featuring brackets and channels that suggested electrical and mechanical systems had once run here. The corridor extended in both directions, lit dimly by Sarah's phone and the faint glow from the stairwell behind them. To the left, it ended quickly, at what appeared to be a maintenance closet. To the right, it continued into darkness, with several doors visible along its length. They moved right. The first door opened onto a small room filled with empty shelving units, industrial metal racks that had probably held supplies or materials. Nothing remained but dust patterns, where boxes or containers had once sat. The second room was similar, empty and unremarkable. The third door was different, heavier, with a more substantial lock that hadn't yielded to time the way the stairwell door had. Sarah examined it closely, noting that unlike everything else in the building, this lock showed no signs of rust or degradation. Someone had maintained it, or at least it had been protected from the elements in a way that suggested importance. She pulled harder on the rebar, wedging it deeper, applying more force than seemed wise. The metal bent, and she stopped, not wanting to break her only tool. Emma watched silently, her small hand still gripping Sarah's jacket. "Mama, I don't like it here. It's too dark." "I know, baby. Just a few more minutes." Sarah tried a different approach, working the rebar around the lock's edges, looking for weaknesses in the frame. As she adjusted her angle, her phone light swept across the door's surface and caught something she'd missed. Stenciled letters, faded but still legible. Archive storage. Authorized personnel only. Archive storage. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding. This wasn't a storage area for chemicals or manufacturing supplies. This was records, documents, potentially things that had retained value beyond the building itself. She attacked the lock with renewed focus, using the rebar as a lever and bracing herself against the opposite wall for maximum pressure. Something groaned. The doorframe, maybe, or the lock mechanism itself. She pushed harder, feeling muscles strain. Aware that she was probably being reckless, but unable to stop now that purpose had entered the equation. The lock gave way suddenly, tearing free from wood that had been stronger than it looked. Sarah stumbled forward, catching herself against the door as it swung inward. Cool air rushed out, noticeably different from the corridor's ambient temperature. It smelled of paper and must and something else, something that made her pause. She raised her phone, sweeping the light across the room beyond. The space was large, probably 20 feet by 30, with a ceiling lower than the corridor suggested, and it was full. Filing cabinets lined 3 walls, floor to ceiling. Metal shelves occupied the center, their surfaces crowded with boxes, binders, and stacks of materials organized with a precision that had survived decades of neglect. But what stopped Sarah's breath wasn't the quantity of stored materials. It was what sat in the center of the room, impossible to miss, even in the inadequate light of her phone. A massive safe, taller than she was, its dark metal surface unmarred by time. And surrounding it, arranged on tables that had been carefully positioned, were wooden crates. Not falling apart, not degraded by moisture or age. Sealed, solid, bearing stamps and markings she couldn't quite read from the doorway. Sarah stepped into the room slowly. Emma pressed against her side. The air here felt different, controlled somehow, as if the space had been engineered to preserve rather than simply store. She approached the safe, running her hand along its surface. The metal was cold, smooth, the combination dial still intact and movable. She turned to the nearest crate, brushing dust from its surface to reveal stenciling. U.S. Mint, Philadelphia. Below that, a date, 1964, and below that, series numbers that meant nothing to her. Her hands were shaking as she reached for the crowbar-like tool, leaning against the wall near the crates, probably left there by whoever had last accessed this room. She wedged it under the lid of the nearest crate, applying pressure carefully. The nails resisted, then gave with small shrieks that echoed in the confined space. Inside, wrapped in protective paper that crinkled at her touch, she found stacks of coins. Not loose, but professionally bundled, each stack bound with paper bands bearing official seals. She lifted one bundle, feeling its weight, and pulled away the protective wrapping. Silver. Unmistakably silver, gleaming dully in her phone's light. Kennedy $50. Dozens of them, their surfaces pristine, their edges sharp. She set that bundle down and reached for another crate, her breathing shallow now, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, what is all this?" Sarah couldn't answer. She moved to another crate, then another. Silver dollars, quarters, dimes, all bearing dates from the early 1960s, all in uncirculated condition, all stored with a care that spoke of intention and value. She counted at least 20 crates visible, and her light caught the edges of more beyond them, stacked in shadows she hadn't fully explored. She turned to the filing cabinets, pulling open the nearest drawer. Inside, organized with the same meticulous care as the coins, were documents. Not ordinary business records, but certificates, stock certificates, bearer bonds, deeds, insurance policies, all bearing her uncle's name, or the company's name, dating from the factory's operational years. Sarah sank to the floor, her legs unable to hold her weight. Emma knelt beside her, confused, frightened by her mother's reaction. Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the solid reality of the small body against hers, needing that anchor as her understanding of the situation underwent complete reversal. This wasn't a worthless inheritance. This was something else entirely. She didn't yet understand the full scope, didn't have the expertise to assess value with any precision. But the silver alone, in the quantity she was seeing, represented more money than she'd ever imagined possessing. And the documents, if they retained any legal standing, might multiply that value beyond calculation. Her uncle hadn't left her a burden. He'd left her a fortune, hidden beneath the decaying shell of failure, preserved in a room that time and the world had forgotten to reclaim. Sarah's phone battery was dying, the screen dimming with warning. She had no way to secure this room, no ability to protect what she'd found, beyond hoping it could remain hidden a little longer. She stood slowly, looking around one more time, committing the space to memory. Then she guided Emma back toward the stairs, toward the light, toward a world that had suddenly, impossibly, expanded with possibility. As they climbed, Emma asked the question Sarah couldn't yet answer. "Mama, does this mean we don't have to be scared anymore?" Sarah paused on the stairs, her daughter's hand in hers, the weight of discovery pressing down with equal parts wonder and terror. "I don't know, baby, but I think things are about to change." They emerged into the factory's ground floor, blinking in the relatively bright light filtering through broken windows. Sarah's mind was already moving, calculating, planning. She needed to secure the building, document what she'd found, find experts who could authenticate and appraise, navigate whatever legal and tax implications came with sudden, unexpected wealth. But first, she needed to get Emma home, to let her daughter see that her mother was steady, capable, unshaken by what they'd discovered. The terror could come later, in private, when Sarah allowed herself to fully comprehend how close she'd come to walking away from this inheritance, how easily she could have signed papers and moved on, never knowing what lay beneath the decay. They made their way back to the car in silence. Sarah locked the gate behind them, checking twice to make sure it was secure. As they pulled away from the factory, Emma fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the long day and the emotional undercurrents she'd sensed without understanding. Sarah drove carefully, her eyes on the road, but her mind still in that basement room, still trying to make sense of what her uncle had done. Why hide such wealth? Why not liquidate it before his death, or leave clear instructions? Why let her inherit not just a fortune, but a mystery that came wrapped in danger and complexity? The drive back passed in a blur. By the time they reached their apartment, evening was settling in, lights beginning to glow in windows up and down the street. Sarah carried Emma inside, tucked her into bed, still wearing her day clothes, and then stood alone in her kitchen, staring at nothing. Her phone rang, and she answered automatically, barely processing the caller ID. Her sister's voice filled the silence, asking about the factory visit, probably expecting to hear confirmation that it was exactly the worthless pile Sarah had feared. "It's complicated," Sarah said, and that was all she could manage. "I need to go back," I need to figure some things out." After she ended the call, she opened her laptop and began searching for information about silver coins, about bearer bonds, about how inherited assets were valued and taxed. The information came at her in fragments, overwhelming in its complexity. She would need lawyers, accountants, security, probably law enforcement involvement at some point. But beneath the anxiety and the practical concerns, something else was stirring. Hope, real and fragile and dangerous. Hope that the calculations she'd performed for years, the endless mental arithmetic of survival, might finally find a different equation. Hope that Emma might grow up without learning to ration bites of food, without understanding that asking for things meant burdening her mother. Sarah pulled the nameplate from her pocket, her uncle's name etched in fading letters. She didn't know why he'd done this, why he'd built this strange inheritance of apparent failure, hiding impossible fortune. But she understood, perhaps, what he'd been protecting. Not just wealth, but possibility. A chance for family, even distant family he barely knew, to find something beyond struggle. She set the nameplate on her kitchen counter. A small memorial to a man whose final gift was beginning to reveal itself. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent to personal transformations. But inside their small apartment, in the quiet space between one life and whatever came next, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't taste like fear. The work ahead would be enormous. The risks were real. But sitting there in the gathering dark, with her daughter asleep in the next room and a fortune hidden beneath a crumbling factory 40 miles away, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. She felt ready. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Emma's soft breathing from across the room, her mind cycling through the same sequence of images. The safe, the crates, the filing cabinets filled with documents she couldn't yet interpret. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw silver gleaming in the inadequate light of her phone, felt the weight of those bundled coins in her hand. By dawn, she'd convinced herself 3 separate times that she'd imagined the entire discovery, that stress and desperation had conjured a hallucination she'd mistaken for reality. The 4th time through the cycle, she forced herself out of bed and made coffee with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. She called in sick to the diner, the first time she'd done so in 18 months. Her manager's voice carried barely concealed irritation, but Sarah found she couldn't summon the usual apologetic energy. Something had shifted in her. Some fundamental relationship with fear that no longer functioned the way it had 24 hours earlier. After dropping Emma at school with promises of pizza for dinner, a luxury they hadn't afforded in months, Sarah drove back to Riverside Mills. The factory looked different in morning light, less ominous, almost benign in its decay. She parked in the same spot and sat for a moment, gathering courage that felt inadequate for what lay ahead. The gate lock opened with the same solid click. She made her way to the broken door, squeezed through, and descended into the basement with a flashlight she'd bought at a gas station on the drive up. The beam was stronger than her phone's light had been, pushing back shadows more aggressively. The corridor looked exactly as she'd left it. The archive room door hung slightly ajar, her forced entry obvious in the torn wood around the lock. She stepped inside and swept the flashlight across the space, needing visual confirmation that the previous night hadn't been elaborate self-deception. The safe stood where it had stood. The crates occupied their same positions. The filing cabinets lined the walls with unchanged patience. Sarah released a breath she hadn't known she was holding and moved to the nearest crate, the one she'd partially opened. In daylight's indirect influence filtering down from above, she could see details she'd missed in the darkness. She lifted out another bundle of coins, examining them more carefully. The protective wrapping was brittle but intact. suggesting these hadn't been disturbed since they were first sealed. The paper bands bore official markings, dates, facility codes. These weren't someone's personal collection. They were mint products, stored in quantity, preserved with institutional care. Sarah set down the flashlight and began documenting everything with her phone camera. Wide shots of the room, close-ups of individual crates and their markings, detailed images of coin bundles and the certificates visible in the filing cabinets. She worked methodically, fighting the urge to tear into every crate and examine every document. That kind of chaos would only complicate things later. When she'd photographed everything accessible without disturbing the arrangement, she turned her attention to the safe. It was a monster, probably weighing several thousand pounds, its combination dial worn smooth by use, but still functional. She tried the handle experimentally, unsurprised when it didn't budge. Whatever this safe contained had been secured with intention. The filing cabinets proved more accessible. Sarah pulled open drawer after drawer, finding them organized with a logic that suggested professional archival work. Each folder was labeled, dates and categories clearly marked. She pulled out several at random, spreading them on one of the tables to examine. Bearer bonds from the 1960s and 70s, their elaborate certificates declaring values that seemed impossibly high. Stock certificates for companies she didn't recognize, some probably defunct, others possibly still trading under different names. Property deeds for parcels of land, scattered across 3 counties. Insurance policies with cash values listed in careful typing. Contracts for timber rights, mineral rights, water rights. The scale of it overwhelmed her understanding. Her uncle had clearly been more than a factory manager. This was the accumulated wealth of someone who'd operated at levels of business and investment she had no framework for comprehending. And he'd hidden it all here, beneath the ruins of his professional life, sealed away from the world with a thoroughness that suggested fear or paranoia, or perhaps just the eccentricity of a man who'd outlived his context. Sarah photographed the most significant documents, trying to capture details that might matter later. Serial numbers on bonds, legal descriptions on deeds, corporate names, and share quantities on stock certificates. Her phone's storage filled rapidly, forcing her to delete old photos, messages, anything non-essential to make room. She was so absorbed in the work that she didn't hear the footsteps above until they were directly overhead. The sound of boots on concrete, careful but not stealthy. Multiple people, moving through the building's ground floor with purpose. Sarah's heart rate spiked immediately. She switched off her flashlight and stood perfectly still, listening. The footsteps paused, then continued, accompanied now by voices. Male, rough with the local accent she'd noted in town yesterday. They were discussing something, their words muffled by the floor between them, but their tone clear. This was their place, or so they believed. They'd come here before. She heard them testing doors, moving closer to the area above the basement entrance. If they found the broken door, if they decided to investigate, she was trapped. The stairwell was the only way out, and she couldn't secure the archive room from inside. Everything she'd found, everything that might change her life, could be compromised by strangers who probably saw the factory as nothing more than a source of scrap metal and trespass thrills. Sarah moved to the archive room door and eased it closed as quietly as possible, wincing at every small sound. Then she positioned herself behind one of the filing cabinets, phone in hand, preparing to call 911 if the situation deteriorated beyond her ability to talk her way out. The voices grew louder, closer. She heard one man laughing, another responding with crude humor. Then footsteps on the stairs, descending into the basement corridor. Sarah's breathing went shallow. Her finger hovered over the emergency call button on her phone. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. "Told you," one voice said. "Someone's been down here. That door wasn't open before." "Could have been kids," another voice responded. "They break in here all the time." "Yeah, maybe." Sarah heard them moving down the corridor, checking the storage room she'd explored the previous day. Each door opened and closed with metallic scrapes that echoed unnaturally. They were getting closer to the archive room, and she had no good options. Confrontation felt dangerous. Hiding felt impossible. Calling police would mean explaining her presence, revealing what she'd found before she'd had time to secure it properly. The archive room door rattled as someone tested the handle. Sarah pressed herself tighter against the filing cabinet, making herself as small as possible in the inadequate shadows. The door opened, spilling corridor light into the room. "Well, hell," one of the men said. "Would you look at this?" Two figures entered, their silhouettes backlit, faces obscured. Sarah could see them scanning the room, noting the safe, the crates, the filing cabinets. One moved toward the partially opened crate, the one she'd left exposed in her initial exploration. "Jimmy, you seeing this? This is silver, man. Real silver." The second man, Jimmy presumably, joined the first at the crate. Sarah watched them handle the coins with rough familiarity, heard their voices rise with excitement. They understood what they were looking at, understood its value, even if they couldn't calculate it precisely. "How much you think is here?" the first man asked. "Enough to make leaving town look real appealing," Jimmy responded. "Question is, who does it belong to?" "Building's abandoned. Finders keepers, far as I'm concerned." Sarah made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She stood up, stepping out from behind the filing cabinet with her phone raised, flashlight activated, pointed directly at their faces. "It belongs to me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And you're trespassing on private property." Both men jerked back, startled. The one holding coins dropped them, the bundles hitting the floor with dull thuds. In the beam of her light, Sarah could see them clearly now. Mid-30s, wearing work clothes stained with grease and dirt, faces hardened by years of manual labor and probably harder living. Jimmy recovered first, his expression shifting from surprise to something more calculating. "Private property. Lady, this place has been empty for 30 years. And I inherited it 3 days ago. I have documentation, and I've already filed the claim with the county. You need to leave. Now." The first man, smaller than Jimmy, but with eyes that held more immediate threat, smiled without warmth. "You came here alone? To claim a building full of valuables? That's either brave or stupid." "Neither. It's legal ownership. And I'm not alone." Sarah raised her phone slightly. "I have 911 ready to dial, and there are 2 other people upstairs documenting everything. This is your one chance to walk away before this becomes a criminal matter." It was a complete bluff. There was no one upstairs, and her phone barely had signal in the basement. But she delivered the lie with enough conviction that both men hesitated, glancing at each other, reassessing. Jimmy took a step back. "Come on, Derek. This ain't worth the trouble." Derek stared at Sarah for a long moment, and she stared back, refusing to break eye contact. Finally, he shrugged and followed Jimmy toward the door. Before leaving, he turned back. "Word of advice, lady. You're going to want better security than padlocks and lies. Lots of people around here know about this building, and news travels." They left, their footsteps retreating up the stairs with deliberate slowness, letting her know they weren't hurried by her threats. Sarah remained frozen until she heard them exit the building above, heard a truck engine start and fade into distance. Then she allowed herself to shake. Her legs felt unreliable, and she had to sit down on one of the tables, adrenaline leaving her system in waves that made her nauseous. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes. But it had made several things absolutely clear. She couldn't protect this discovery alone. She needed help, official help, and she needed it before word spread further. Derek was right. News would travel, and people with fewer scruples than Jimmy and Derek would come looking. The factory's isolation, which had preserved its secrets for decades, now made it vulnerable. Sarah gathered herself and began working faster. She photographed more documents, grabbed several of the most official-looking certificates from the filing cabinets, and carefully resealed the crate she'd opened. Before leaving the archive room, she pulled the door closed and wedged debris from the corridor against it, a pathetic obstacle that wouldn't stop anyone determined, but might slow them down. She emerged from the factory into midday sun that felt accusatory, as if the brightness itself was judging her for working in shadows. Back in her car, she sat with the engine running, trying to decide on the right sequence of actions. Police first? A lawyer? An appraiser? Each option carried risks and complications she wasn't equipped to navigate. She pulled out the business card the attorney had included with his letter, the one handling her uncle's estate. She dialed the number with fingers that still trembled slightly. The attorney, whose name was David Brennan, answered on the third ring. Sarah explained where she was, what she'd found, and the morning's confrontation in terms as clear as she could manage, while her pulse was still elevated. Brennan's response was immediate and decisive. "Don't go back there alone. I'm contacting local law enforcement and a security firm." "Can you meet me at the property in 2 hours?" "Yes." "Good. And Ms. Mitchell? Don't discuss this with anyone else. No family, no friends. Not until we've secured the site and begun proper assessment." Sarah agreed and ended the call. 2 hours felt impossibly long. She drove into Riverside Mills proper and found the diner she'd noticed the previous day. Inside, the lunch crowd consisted of maybe 6 people, all local, all watching her with the casual suspicion small towns reserved for strangers. She ordered coffee and a sandwich she didn't want, needing to fill time and appear normal. The waitress, a woman in her 50s, with a face that had learned to trust no one, set down the coffee with practiced efficiency. "You're the one who inherited the old paper factory," she said. Not a question. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "How did you know that?" "Honey, this is Riverside Mills. Somebody sneezes on the east side. We hear about it on the west side before they reach for a tissue. Word is you drove up from the city to take a look at it." "Just assessing my options." The waitress smiled, and it wasn't unkind. "Options with that place start and end with demolition. Your Uncle Thomas, he was a good man. But he held on to that building way past the time he should have let it go. Sometimes the things we love most are the things we need to walk away from." Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to respond. The waitress moved away to tend to other customers, and Sarah sat with her coffee, feeling exposed and isolated in equal measure. If the town already knew she'd inherited the factory, how long before they knew about what lay beneath it? How long before her brief window of advantage closed completely? She ate mechanically, watching the clock on the wall count down minutes with deliberate slowness. When she finally paid and left, the waitress called after her. "Be careful out there. Old buildings can be dangerous in ways you don't expect." Back at the factory, Sarah waited in her car until she saw Brennan's sedan pull up, followed closely by a sheriff's cruiser and an unmarked van. The attorney emerged first, a man in his early 60s with the bearing of someone accustomed to difficult conversations. The sheriff was younger, maybe 40, with a weathered face and eyes that assessed her with professional neutrality. Brennan made introductions, Sheriff Marcus Cole and 2 men from a private security firm, ex-military by the look of them, who didn't offer names and weren't asked for them. "Ms. Mitchell, before we proceed, I need to confirm a few things," Brennan said. You're claiming you've discovered significant assets stored on this property. Assets you believe belong to your uncle's estate. Not claiming. I found them. In a sealed basement room. Silver coins, documents, a safe I haven't been able to open yet. Sheriff Cole exchanged a look with Brennan. You're talking about materials that might constitute unclaimed property, possibly reportable to the state. We need to document this properly. I understand. That's why I called. They entered the building as a group, Sarah leading the way to the basement entrance. The security men went first, checking the route with flashlights and what looked like professional paranoia. When they reached the archive room, Brennan let out a low whistle at the sight of the crates and filing cabinets. "Sheriff, we're going to need more people," he said quietly. What followed was a blur of activity that stretched into evening. More law enforcement arrived, including investigators who specialized in property crimes and unclaimed assets. Photographers documented everything. The security firm began the process of cataloging crates, though Brennan insisted nothing be removed until proper legal protocols were established. Sarah stood to the side, answering questions when asked, watching strangers handle discoveries that still felt intensely personal. One of the investigators, a woman named Torres, approached her with a tablet displaying photographs. "Ms. Mitchell, we've done preliminary research on some of the bond serial numbers and stock certificates you photographed. I need to prepare you for what we're finding." Sarah braced herself. "Go ahead." Several of these bonds are still active, never redeemed. Their maturity values have been accruing interest for decades. The stock certificates include holdings in companies that went through mergers and acquisitions, meaning they may have converted to shares in current corporations at significantly higher values than original purchase prices. And the property deeds reference parcels that are now within developed areas worth substantially more than they were in the 1960s and 70s. How substantially? Torres hesitated, then met Sarah's eyes directly. "We won't know for certain until full appraisal, but conservatively? You're looking at tens of millions of dollars. The silver alone, at current market prices, could be worth 20 to 30 million. If the bonds and stocks have retained legal validity, and if the properties are unencumbered, you could be looking at a total value in excess of $300 million. The number didn't register at first. It was too large, too disconnected from any financial reality Sarah had ever inhabited. 300 million. She heard herself laugh, a short, disbelieving sound that drew concerned looks from nearby personnel. "That's not possible," she said. "It's not confirmed," Torres corrected. "But it's within the range of possibility based on what we're seeing. Your uncle appears to have been an extraordinarily savvy investor who, for reasons we may never fully understand, chose to hide his wealth rather than utilize it." Sarah sat down on one of the archive tables, her legs giving out again. Brennan appeared at her side, his hand on her shoulder, steadying. "Ms. Mitchell, you need to understand that this discovery triggers significant legal processes, tax implications, probate complexities, potential challenges from other heirs or the state. This won't be simple." "Other heirs?" Sarah's voice came out hollow. "There are no other heirs. My uncle never married, had no children. I'm it. We'll need to verify that. But assuming it's accurate, you're still facing substantial tax liability, probably in the range of 40% of the estate's value. You'll need accountants, attorneys, security, probably investment advisors. The next several months are going to be extraordinarily complicated." Sarah nodded, not fully processing, still trying to connect the abstract number Torres had given her to any concrete meaning. Even after taxes, even after legal fees, and all the complications Brennan was describing, she would have more money than she could conceptualize. More money than her mother had earned in her entire life. More money than anyone she'd ever known had ever possessed. The implications cascaded through her mind in fragments. Emma's medical bills, erased. Student loans, gone. Rent, utilities, groceries, all the arithmetic that had defined her existence, suddenly irrelevant. They could have a house. Emma could go to good schools. College would be paid for before she reached high school. Every door that had been closed by poverty would open. But underneath the euphoria lurked something darker. Doubt. Fear that this wasn't real. That someone would find a legal technicality that invalidated her claim. Fear that family members she hadn't spoken to in years would emerge with challenges. Fear that the wealth itself would prove corrupting, changing her into someone she didn't recognize. Ms. Mitchell. Sheriff Cole's voice pulled her back to the present. We need to ask you about the two men you encountered here this morning. Can you describe them? Sarah provided descriptions as detailed as she could remember. Cole nodded, making notes. Derek Paulson and Jimi Hendrix. Local troublemakers. Mostly small-time stuff. Breaking and entering, theft, that kind of thing. We'll have a talk with them, make it clear this property is under active protection now. Will they be arrested? Probably not, unless you want to press charges. They left when you asked them to, technically. But we'll make sure they understand that returning would be a serious mistake. The security team worked through the night, installing proper locks, motion sensors, and camera systems. By morning, the factory had been transformed from abandoned ruin to secured facility, at least in the sections that mattered. The basement was now accessible only through a steel door with electronic locks, and the archive room itself had been reinforced with additional security measures. Sarah didn't fully understand, but found reassuring. Brennan stayed with her through most of it, explaining processes and timelines. The estate would need to be officially reopened, the assets cataloged and appraised by certified professionals, tax authorities notified, probate court petitioned. It would take months, possibly over a year, before any of the wealth could be accessed. In the meantime, Brennan said as dawn broke over the factory, you'll need to continue your life as normally as possible. The security firm will maintain the site. We'll begin the legal processes. But you can't start spending money you don't have yet, no matter how certain we are that it's coming. Sarah understood. She was simultaneously wealthy beyond measure and still broke, living in that strange liminal space between one reality and another. She would have to return to her apartment, to her job at the diner, to the bills that didn't care about future fortunes. The drive home felt surreal. She'd been awake for over 30 hours, and exhaustion made the familiar landscape seem dreamlike. When she finally pulled into her apartment complex, she saw her sister's car parked in her assigned spot. Jennifer was waiting outside the door, arms crossed, expression hovering between concern and irritation. "Where the hell have you been? I've been calling. Emma's school called me when you didn't pick her up." Sarah had forgotten. Completely. Utterly forgotten. The realization hit her like cold water. Oh God, is she okay? She's fine. She's at my place. Sarah, what is going on with you? They went inside, and Sarah tried to explain in terms that wouldn't reveal everything. She'd been dealing with the inheritance. It was more complicated than she'd expected. She'd lost track of time. Jennifer listened with increasing skepticism. "You look like hell. When was the last time you slept?" "I don't know. Yesterday?" Jennifer sighed. The sound heavy with judgment Sarah had heard her entire life. "This is about that factory, isn't it? Sarah, I know you're desperate, but you can't let that place consume you. It's worthless. You need to sign whatever papers will release you from it and move on. It's not worthless. Then sell it for scrap. Get whatever you can. But don't waste your time and energy on some fantasy that a condemned building is going to solve your problems." Sarah wanted to scream. She wanted to pull out her phone and show Jennifer the photographs, to explain that the fantasy was real, that the worthless inheritance was actually salvation. But Brennan's warning echoed in her mind. Don't discuss this with anyone. Not until it's secured. I'm handling it, Sarah said instead. I just need you to trust me. Jennifer's expression made clear how unlikely that trust was. Fine. Handle it. But Emma deserves better than a mother who forgets to pick her up from school because she's chasing pipe dreams in a condemned building. The words stung because they were partially true. Sarah had lost herself in the discovery, had let her responsibilities slide in ways that could have endangered her daughter. The wealth she'd found wouldn't matter if she lost Emma's trust, or worse, lost custody, because she demonstrated herself as unfit. After Jennifer left, promising to bring Emma back in the morning, Sarah collapsed onto her couch and stared at the ceiling. The apartment felt smaller than ever, its limitations more pronounced now that she knew they were temporary. But temporary could stretch months, and she had to survive that span without revealing what she knew, without changing her life in ways that would draw questions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Brennan. Preliminary appraisal scheduled for next week. Say nothing to anyone. We'll update soon. Sarah set the phone aside and closed her eyes. She'd found a fortune. She'd secured it, started the legal processes that would make it real. And now she had to wait, living her small life, letting people think she was foolish for clinging to worthless property, enduring judgment and doubt while sitting on a secret that would eventually silence every skeptic who dismissed her. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she'd been invisible, her struggles unseen by people too comfortable to notice. Now she possessed wealth beyond most people's comprehension. And she had to remain invisible a while longer, hiding abundance while performing poverty. She slept finally, dreamlessly, and woke to Emma's voice in the hallway hours later. Her daughter burst through the door, relief and reproach mixing in her small face. Mama, you forgot me. I know, baby. I'm so sorry. Emma climbed onto the couch beside her, and Sarah held her close, feeling the solid reality of the small body against hers. This was what mattered. Not the silver, or the bonds, or the abstract millions. This child, this trust, this relationship that poverty had strained, but not broken. Are you still scared, Mama? Sarah considered the question carefully. The discovery in the factory had changed many things, but fear wasn't entirely gone. It had just transformed, shifting from immediate survival terror to a new anxiety about protecting what she'd found, about navigating complexity she didn't fully understand. But Emma needed a different answer. Emma needed to hear hope. Not as much as I was, baby. Things are going to get better. I promise. Emma nodded against her chest, accepting the promise with the absolute faith of childhood. Sarah held her tighter, understanding that she'd just committed herself to making those words true, whatever it took. Outside their window, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside their small apartment, surrounded by bills and broken things, a woman held her daughter and protected a secret that would soon transform them both. But not yet. Not quite yet. For now, Sarah Mitchell remained exactly what she appeared to be, a broke single mother working the overnight shift at a diner, struggling to keep her head above water, her inheritance nothing but a condemned building nobody wanted. Only she knew different. Only she knew that beneath the decay, sealed in darkness, a fortune waited with infinite patience for the moment when it could finally emerge into light. The preliminary appraisal took 3 days. Sarah watched from the factory's perimeter as teams of specialists moved in and out of the building, their vehicles creating a constant flow of activity that drew attention from passing locals. She didn't enter herself, following Brennan's advice to maintain distance while professionals worked. By the second day, news vans appeared. Someone had leaked information. Probably one of the sheriff's deputies, or a security contractor who'd seen enough to understand what they were protecting. The reporters tried to approach Sarah at her apartment, at the diner, anywhere they could find her. She refused every interview, said nothing, and watched as speculation filled the vacuum her silence created. The stories started cautiously. Significant discovery at abandoned factory. Possible valuable assets found in Riverside Mills property. But by the third day, as more information leaked and sources talked to journalists hungry for details, the headlines grew bolder. Hidden fortune discovered in condemned building. Single mother inherits millions in silver. Bonds. Sarah stopped reading after the first few articles. The details were half wrong. The quotes attributed to unnamed sources were sensationalized, and her life was being dissected by strangers who understood nothing about what the past 2 years had cost her. Emma came home from school crying on Wednesday, 4 days after the appraisal began. A teacher had mentioned seeing Sarah's name in the news, and the other children had surrounded Emma during recess, asking questions she couldn't answer, calling her a liar when she said she didn't know what they were talking about. Sarah held her daughter in the apartment's small bathroom, the only space that felt even remotely private, and tried to explain things she didn't fully understand herself. Remember the building we visited? The one that looked so sad? There were valuable things hidden inside, things that belonged to your great-uncle, things that now belong to us. Are we rich, Mama? The question was asked without excitement, almost with dread, as if Emma had already learned that being different was dangerous. Sarah understood. In their neighborhood, in Emma's school, sudden wealth wouldn't be celebrated. It would be isolating. We're going to be okay, Sarah said instead. But it's going to take time, and things are going to be confusing for a while. I need you to be patient with me. Can you do that? Emma nodded, but her eyes held worry that no 6-year-old should carry. Sarah felt anger rising, not at her daughter, but at the situation that had put them in this impossible position. She'd found wealth that should have brought relief, but the discovery process itself was inflicting new wounds. That night, after Emma finally slept, Sarah's phone rang. Brennan's voice was carefully neutral. Ms. Mitchell, the preliminary appraisal is complete. I need you to come to my office tomorrow morning. Bring identification and any documentation related to your uncle's estate that you still possess. What did they find? We'll discuss it in person. 10 a.m., if that works for you. Sarah called in sick to the diner again, her manager's response cold enough to suggest her job security was becoming questionable. She didn't care the way she once would have. That realization unsettled her. She was already changing, already allowing herself to think beyond the immediate survival calculations that had governed her life for so long. Brennan's office occupied the second floor of an old building in the county seat, a 40-minute drive from Sarah's apartment. The waiting room held furniture that tried too hard to project success, leather chairs that squeaked when she sat. Magazines she didn't read. She was the only person waiting. When Brennan's assistant finally called her back, Sarah followed on legs that felt unreliable. The attorney's private office was smaller than she'd expected, its walls lined with legal texts and framed certificates that testified to decades of practice. Brennan sat behind a desk covered in documents, and beside him was Torres, the investigator from the sheriff's department, and a woman Sarah didn't recognize. Ms. Mitchell, this is Patricia Harmon, a certified appraiser specializing in historical assets and collectibles, Brennan said. She's been overseeing the evaluation. Harmon nodded, her expression professional but not unkind. She was perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back severely and hands that looked like they'd handled countless valuable objects with patient expertise. Ms. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct, because there's no gentle way to deliver these findings, Harmon began. The assets discovered in your uncle's archive represent one of the most significant private collections of mid-20th century numismatic, and financial instruments we've encountered in this region. She opened a folder and pulled out a summary sheet, sliding it across the desk to Sarah. The numbers were organized in categories, each line representing staggering sums that Sarah's eyes struggled to process. The silver coins, all pre-1965 specimens, contain approximately 47,000 pounds of 900 fine silver. At current market rates, the metal content alone is valued at roughly $34 million. However, many of the coins are in uncirculated condition, which adds significant numismatic premium. Conservative auction estimates place the collection's total value between $60 and $80 million. Sarah stared at the paper, the numbers refusing to acquire meaning. Harmon continued. The bearer bonds present more complexity. 23 of the 47 bonds we examined have reached maturity and include accrued interest spanning decades. Combined maturity value exceeds $90 million, though collecting will require coordination with the issuing institutions and verification of the bond's legal status. The stock certificates, Torres added, represent holdings in 17 different corporations. 12 of those companies still exist, either independently or through merger acquisitions. The shares have undergone splits and consolidations, but based on current trading prices and conversion rates, we estimate their total value at approximately $112 million. Brennan picked up the narrative. The property deeds reference 8 parcels of land. 3 have been absorbed into urban development and are now zoned commercial. 2 are in areas where land values have increased substantially. Current market appraisals for these properties, if sold at fair value, total roughly $47 million. Sarah's hands had gone numb. She flexed her fingers, trying to restore circulation, and realized she'd stopped breathing at some point. She forced air into her lungs. There are also miscellaneous assets, Harmon said. Rare books, some artwork, collectible items that individually don't represent major value, but collectively add another $3 to $5 million. And then there's the safe. What's in the safe? Sarah heard herself ask, her voice distant. We don't know yet. Your uncle used a sophisticated locking mechanism that we haven't been able to bypass without risking damage to the contents. We have a specialist coming in next week who may be able to open it non-destructively. Whatever's inside could significantly alter these figures, either direction. Brennan leaned forward, his expression serious. Ms. Mitchell, the total appraised value of your inheritance, excluding the unopened safe, is approximately $376 million. The number hung in the air. Sarah stared at it on the paper, trying to make it real. $376 million. More than she would earn in 100 lifetimes. More than everyone she knew combined would earn. It was abstract, impossible, a figure that belonged to lottery winners and corporate executives, not to a woman who'd reheated coffee at the diner to save 50 cents. After taxes, Brennan continued, both estate and inheritance, you're looking at roughly $210 million net. There will be additional costs, legal fees, security, appraisal and authentication expenses, storage and insurance. But conservatively, Ms. Mitchell, you're going to receive a distribution exceeding $200 million. Sarah felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. Not tears of joy exactly, but release. Years of tension, of fear, of calculations that never balanced. All of it draining out in silent tears that she couldn't stop and didn't try to. Harmon pushed a box of tissues across the desk. No one spoke while Sarah cried, allowing her the dignity of processing without commentary. When she finally regained some measure of composure, Brennan resumed. The process will take time, 6 months minimum, possibly longer. The IRS will need to review everything. The probate court will need to validate the estate distribution. and various financial institutions will need to process claims on the bonds and securities. During that period, you'll need to be patient. But, Torres interjected, given the clear evidence of your claim and the lack of competing heirs, Judge Morrison has authorized an emergency distribution to cover immediate needs. $50,000. Available within 72 hours. 50,000. A number that had once seemed impossibly large now felt almost trivial against the backdrop of 300 million. But Sarah understood what $50,000 meant in practical terms. Rent, bills, Emma's medical expenses, food that didn't require strategic rationing, shoes that fit properly, a car that didn't threaten to break down with every turn of the key. "Thank you," she whispered. The meeting continued for another hour, covering logistics and timelines, legal requirements, and tax implications. Sarah signed documents, accepted business cards from financial advisors Brennan recommended, and listened to advice about discretion and security. Don't discuss specific amounts. Don't make large purchases yet. Don't trust people who suddenly appear claiming connection or need. When she finally left the office, stepping out into midday sun that felt too bright, too ordinary for what had just happened, she sat in her car for 20 minutes before starting the engine. Her phone showed 17 missed calls, most from numbers she didn't recognize. Word was spreading faster than she could process. The drive back to her apartment passed in a fog. She kept returning to the number, turning it over in her mind like a stone too large to pocket. $200 million. The phrase had no weight, no texture, nothing to anchor it to reality. She picked up Emma from school, noting the stares from other parents, the whispers that followed them to the car. Emma climbed in silently, her backpack clutched tight, and didn't speak until they were several blocks away. "Mama, everyone knows about the money." "I know." "Baby. They're saying mean things, that we don't deserve it, that we're going to leave and never come back." Sarah pulled over, put the car in park, and turned to face her daughter. "Do you want to leave?" Emma considered the question seriously. "I don't know. I like my school. I like Miss Patterson. But everyone's being weird now." "People are going to be weird for a while. Change makes people uncomfortable, especially when it happens to others and not to them. But we get to decide what we do with this. The money doesn't control us. We control it." "What are we going to do?" Sarah realized she hadn't thought that far ahead. She'd been so consumed with survival, with getting through each day, that planning for abundance felt like a skill she'd never developed. "What do you think we should do?" Emma's face brightened slightly. "Can we get a house with a yard? And can I have my own room?" "Yes, definitely yes to all of that." "And can we help people? Like people who are scared like we were?" Sarah felt something break open in her chest. Her 6-year-old daughter, who'd learned to ration food and suppress wishes, was thinking about others before herself. "Yes, baby. We can absolutely help people." That evening, after Emma was asleep, Sarah's sister called. Jennifer's voice was tight, controlled in a way that signaled barely suppressed emotion. "I need to talk to you. In person. Tonight, if possible." They met at a coffee shop equidistant between their apartments, a neutral space that felt necessary. Jennifer arrived looking exhausted, her usual composure fractured. She ordered nothing, just sat across from Sarah with hands folded on the table. "Is it true? What they're saying on the news?" Sarah nodded. "Most of it, yes." "How much?" "A lot. More than you're probably thinking." Jennifer closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. "I told you it was worthless. I told you to walk away. I called you stupid for wasting your time on it. You didn't know. I should have supported you anyway. You're my sister. You were struggling, and instead of helping, I judged. I'm so sorry, Sarah." The apology landed strangely. Sarah had expected many reactions to the news, but not this. not genuine contrition. Jen, you were trying to protect me from disappointment. You thought you were being realistic. I was being condescending. I've always been condescending to you. You know why? Jennifer's voice cracked. Because it was easier to look down on your choices than to face the fact that I'm drowning too. Different waters. Same fear. My marriage is falling apart. My perfect suburban life costs more than we can afford. I've been hiding behind criticism because acknowledging your struggles meant acknowledging my own. Sarah reached across the table and took her sister's hand. We're both going to be okay now. I don't want your money. I'm not offering money. I'm offering family. Real family. Without judgment or comparison. We can both stop pretending. They talked until the coffee shop closed, speaking with honesty that years of distance had prevented. When they finally parted, something had shifted between them. Not fixed completely. Damage that deep required more than one conversation. But begun. The emergency distribution arrived in Sarah's bank account on Friday, 3 days after the appraisal meeting. She logged into her banking app and stared at the balance. $5,347. The extra $347.82 was interest accrued during processing, an amount she'd once have celebrated as a windfall, now barely noticeable against the larger sum. She paid rent first, all the back payments that had been hanging over her like a sword. Then utilities, Emma's medical bills, the credit cards she'd maxed out buying groceries and gas. Each payment felt like removing a weight from her shoulders. Physical relief as obligations that had crushed her for months disappeared with simple transfers. When she was done, she still had $32,000. More money than she'd ever had in her account at one time. She sat staring at it, feeling simultaneously wealthy and terrified. This was just the beginning. Soon, very soon, the full inheritance would process, and this abundance that felt overwhelming would become trivial against what was coming. Sarah gave notice at the diner. Her manager's response was curt, resentful. Must be nice, walking away when the rest of us still have to work. She didn't try to explain. There was no explanation that would satisfy, no way to make someone understand that the relief she felt wasn't about escaping work, but about escaping fear. That weekend, she and Emma went house hunting. Not seriously, not yet. Brennan had advised against major purchases until the full distribution cleared. But Sarah wanted Emma to see possibilities, to understand that their life was genuinely changing. They toured 5 houses, each one larger and nicer than the last, and Emma's eyes grew wider with each showing. We could live here, Mama. Really? Soon. Not yet. But soon. The real estate agent, a woman named Carol who'd been kind, despite clearly recognizing Sarah from the news, pulled her aside after the last showing. Word of advice? When you're ready to buy, use an attorney, pay cash, and keep your name off public records. People know what you inherited. You'll want privacy. Sarah thanked her, adding it to the growing list of things wealthy people apparently knew that she didn't. Word continued to spread through their neighborhood, and reactions varied wildly. Some neighbors congratulated her with genuine warmth. Others avoided her completely, their discomfort with her sudden change in status manifesting as cold distance. A few approached with requests, medical bills, car repairs, rent help, each petition delivered with varying degrees of desperation and entitlement. Sarah didn't know how to respond. She wanted to help, but Brennan had warned her about setting precedents, about the impossibility of saying yes to everyone. She started referring people to established charities, promising to make substantial donations once the full inheritance cleared. The factory itself became a curiosity site. Security had to chase away trespassers daily, people who wanted photographs, or to claim they'd always known something valuable was hidden there. Derek and Jimmy, the 2 men who'd confronted Sarah in the basement, gave an interview to a local news station claiming they'd discovered the treasure first and were considering legal action. The story fell apart within days when the reporter actually investigated their claims. 3 weeks after the appraisal, the safe was finally opened. Sarah was present this time, along with Brennan, Torres, and a specialist from New York who'd spent 2 days working on the locking mechanism. When the heavy door finally swung open, revealing the interior, Sarah heard the specialist whistle softly. Inside was more silver, but not coins. Bars of refined silver, each weighing approximately 100 ounces, stacked in neat rows that filled the safe's considerable depth. Harmon, who'd been called in for the opening, began counting while the specialist photographed each bar's markings. 72 bars, Harmon announced finally. 7,200 troy ounces. Current spot price puts this at approximately $200,000, though collector value may add a premium. But it wasn't the silver that captured Sarah's attention. On the safe's top shelf, sealed in plastic, was a letter. Her name was written on the envelope in careful script. Thomas Whitmore's handwriting, preserved and waiting. With trembling hands, she opened it. Dear Sarah, if you're reading this, you've found what I spent my life accumulating and my final years hiding. I imagine you have questions. Why not use this wealth? Why hide it? Why leave it to a niece I barely knew? The answer is both simple and complicated. This fortune was built during years when men like me could work hard and save aggressively and watch investments grow in ways that seem impossible now. I was never smart enough to be wealthy through genius, only patient enough to let time work on my behalf. But wealth changes people, I learned. It corrupted colleagues. It destroyed friendships. It made my siblings treat me as a bank rather than a brother. Your mother was the only one who never asked me for anything, who saw me as Thomas rather than Thomas the Rich. That's why you were always special to me, even when geography and circumstance kept us apart. When she died, I promised myself that if you ever needed this, it would be here. I watched from a distance as you grew, as you struggled, as you built a life that reminded me of your mother's quiet dignity. I could have helped earlier. I should have. But I'd learned that money offered too easily creates dependence rather than strength. So I waited, and I hid this fortune beneath failure, beneath a building everyone dismissed as worthless. I knew that only someone desperate enough to look past appearances, persistent enough to dig deeper, would find it. I knew that would be you. This wealth comes with responsibility. Use it to secure your daughter's future first. Then, if you're so inclined, use it to help others who stand where you once stood. But never let it define you. Money is only a tool. What matters is what you build with it. I'm sorry I couldn't know you better in life, but I'm proud to know that my life's work will serve someone who understands struggle, who appreciates security, who will use abundance with the wisdom that only hardship teaches. Live well, Sarah. You've earned this in ways that have nothing to do with inheritance and everything to do with character. With love and hope, Uncle Thomas. Sarah read it twice, while tears blurred the words, then handed it to Brennan without comment. She couldn't speak. The letter had answered questions she hadn't known how to ask, and validated struggles she'd thought no one saw. Her uncle had watched her, had seen her working multiple jobs, raising Emma alone, fighting to stay afloat. And he'd left this fortune not as charity, but as recognition, as a reward for perseverance. The full estate distribution was approved 4 months after the initial discovery. The morning the final transfer cleared, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification from her bank. $207,000 from $183,932. 18. $207 million in her account. Real. Undeniable. Hers. She sat on the floor of the apartment she'd already given notice on, Emma at school, and let herself feel the full weight of transformation. She would never be afraid again. Not the way she'd been afraid. Never wake at 3 a.m., calculating whether she could afford both electricity and groceries. Never choose between her daughter's medicine and rent. Never measure her worth by the tips strangers left. But the relief wasn't pure. It came mixed with survivor's guilt, with awareness that she'd been saved by accident of genetics, while people who deserved rescue just as much remained trapped. Her uncle's letter echoed. Use it to help others who stand where you once stood. She could do that. She would do that. The house they finally chose was nothing like the mansions she could have afforded. It was a comfortable 4-bedroom in a good school district, big enough for Emma to have space and friends, but not so ostentatious that they'd feel isolated by wealth. Sarah paid cash, kept her name off public records as Carol had advised, and moved in with furniture that was new, but not extravagant. Emma adjusted gradually, her natural resilience serving her well. She made friends in the new neighborhood, children whose parents didn't know or care about the inheritance. She joined soccer, took piano lessons, and slowly began to relax in ways Sarah had worried she'd forgotten how to do. Sarah established a charitable foundation, working with advisors to direct funds toward causes she understood. Medical debt relief, housing assistance for single parents, educational support for low-income students. She funded local food banks and after-school programs. She paid off medical debt for 300 families in her old neighborhood. Each check she signed felt like honoring both her own struggle and her uncle's intention. She avoided publicity where possible, giving only one interview to explain her plans. The journalist asked if she felt guilty having so much when others had nothing. Every day, Sarah answered honestly, but guilt without action is just self-indulgence. So I am acting. 6 months after moving into the new house, she invited Jennifer and her family to dinner. Her sister arrived with wine and genuine smiles, and they cooked together, while Emma showed her cousins the backyard. Over pasta and conversation that felt more real than any they'd had in years, Jennifer asked the question Sarah had been waiting for. "Are you happy?" Sarah considered it carefully. "I'm secure. That's different than happy. But it's the foundation happy needs. For the first time in years, I can think about more than survival." "That's extraordinary. Do you miss anything? About before?" Sarah smiled. "No. Anyone who says money doesn't matter hasn't been poor. It matters. It matters tremendously. Not because it buys happiness, but because it buys choices. And choices are what make happiness possible." The conversation in Riverside Mills changed gradually. At first, Sarah had been a curiosity, gossiped about, resented, celebrated, and criticized in equal measure. But as months passed and the novelty faded, she became simply another resident, albeit one whose generosity had quietly improved the town through donations to the library, the volunteer fire department, and the struggling community center. The factory itself presented a question Sarah struggled with for nearly a year. Demolition was still the practical choice, but she couldn't bring herself to order it. That building had held her salvation. It deserved better than erasure. She consulted with historical preservation societies and architects. Together, they developed a plan to partially restore the structure, preserving the most historically significant sections while making it safe. The ground floor would become a community space, available for events and programs. The upper floors would remain as they were, windows intact, but interior left to its honest decay, a reminder of the town's industrial past. The basement archive became a climate-controlled museum room, accessible by appointment, displaying portions of the collection she'd donated for educational purposes. Not the most valuable pieces, those had been sold to fund her charitable work, but representative samples that told the story of mid-century investment and industrial wealth. On the museum's wall, she installed a plaque with her uncle's letter, his words preserved for others who might need them. Only someone desperate enough to look past appearances, persistent enough to dig deeper, would find it. Emma's 8th birthday party was held in the backyard of their home, surrounded by a dozen friends whose parents Sarah had cautiously befriended. She watched her daughter blow out candles on a cake they'd made together, and felt a peace she'd thought poverty had stolen permanently. Later, after guests had left, and Emma was helping clean up with enthusiasm born from genuine happiness rather than forced responsibility, Sarah's daughter asked a question that cut through everything. "Mama, if Uncle Thomas hadn't left us the money, would you still love me the same?" Sarah knelt to eye level, taking her daughter's face in her hands. "Baby, nothing about how much I love you has anything to do with money. The money changed what we have. It didn't change who we are. But you're not scared anymore. I'm scared of different things now. But you're right. That desperate fear is gone. And that's a gift I'll never take for granted." Emma hugged her fiercely. "I'm glad Uncle Thomas loved you enough to help us." "Me too, baby. Me too." 2 years after the discovery, Sarah attended a charity gala she'd funded, a benefit for medical debt relief in her old county. She wore a simple dress, kept her remarks brief, and deflected praise toward the organizers who did the actual work. As the evening wound down, a woman approached her, mid-30s, wearing clothes that Sarah recognized from her own past, clean but worn, chosen for durability rather than fashion. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to thank you. Your foundation paid off my daughter's medical bills. $300,000 we would have spent our lives buried under. Because of you, we can breathe." Sarah took the woman's hands. "Because of my uncle, who saw value in helping family he barely knew. I'm just passing that forward. It saved us. I don't know if you understand what that means." "I do. I absolutely do." Driving home that night, Sarah thought about the question Jennifer had asked months earlier. Was she happy? The answer had evolved. She was secure, yes. But more than that, she was purposeful. The money had bought her choices, and she was choosing to remember where she'd come from, to honor the desperation that had driven her into a condemned building on a gray Saturday morning. She'd found wealth, but more importantly, she'd found proof that persistence mattered, that looking deeper when everyone else had walked away could uncover miracles, that the overlooked and dismissed sometimes held more value than the celebrated and sought after. Emma was asleep in her bed by the time Sarah got home, her room decorated with posters and books and all the accumulated evidence of a childhood no longer shaped by scarcity. Sarah stood in the doorway, watching her daughter breathe in the peaceful rhythm of security, and felt gratitude so intense it was almost painful. She'd been saved by an uncle's foresight and a fortune's patience. Now she got to spend her life returning that gift to others, one family at a time, proving that the dignity poverty tried to steal could be restored, that hope deferred wasn't hope destroyed. Just hope, waiting for the right moment to bloom. The factory stood in Riverside Mills, partially restored, a monument to transformation. Visitors came occasionally, walked through the community space, climbed the stairs to view the preserved production floor with its broken windows that framed the sky. Some asked about the story, about the woman who'd inherited failure and found fortune beneath it. Sarah never corrected the narrative when it grew mythical in the retelling. Stories needed their embellishments. What mattered was the truth underneath, that she'd been willing to look when others turned away, to dig when others dismissed, to hope when hope seemed ridiculous. And in the basement, behind glass in the climate-controlled archive room, stacks of coins gleamed under careful lighting. Physical proof that overlooked places sometimes held miracles, that family could love across distance and death, and that the best inheritance wasn't wealth itself, but the chance to use wealth with wisdom born from struggle. Sarah Mitchell had found a fortune, but more importantly, she'd found freedom from fear, from limitation, from the arithmetic of poverty that had defined too many years. And in finding freedom, she'd learned to share it, to pass forward the impossible gift that had transformed everything. On quiet nights, standing on her porch with coffee that was actually good, brewed from beans she'd chosen for taste rather than price, Sarah sometimes thought about the morning she'd opened that letter from an attorney. If she'd made a different choice, signed papers to decline the inheritance, walked away from what seemed like another burden, her life would have continued its desperate trajectory toward collapse. But she'd looked deeper. She'd persisted. And beneath the decay, sealed in darkness, preserved by intention and time, salvation had waited with infinite patience. That was the real lesson, she thought. Not that fortune favored the lucky, but that fortune favored those willing to see value where others saw only ruin, to find hope where others had abandoned it, to believe that transformation was possible even when every visible sign suggested otherwise. The factory had been her salvation, but she'd saved herself by being brave enough to enter it. 3 years after the discovery, Sarah found herself standing in the parking lot of her old apartment complex. She hadn't been back since moving out. Hadn't wanted to revisit a place that held so many memories of desperation. But the building's management company had called. They'd found some items in the storage unit she'd abandoned, things she'd left behind in the rush of transformation. The complex looked smaller than she remembered, more worn. Paint peeled from window frames that had always needed attention. The parking lot's cracks had widened, weeds pushing through with increased aggression. It was the same place, but her relationship to it had fundamentally altered. This was no longer home. It was archaeology. The storage unit held exactly what she'd expected: boxes of clothes Emma had outgrown, kitchen items too damaged to move, and a small collection of papers she'd thought unimportant at the time. As she sorted through them, preparing to decide what deserved preservation and what could finally be discarded, she found something that made her hands still. It was a notebook, spiral-bound, its cover water-stained and bent. She'd used it to track expenses during the worst months, when every dollar had required documentation, when she'd needed to see in writing where the money was going to understand why there was never enough. Sarah opened it carefully, the pages crackling with dryness. March 3rd. Rent. Late fee. 1,240. Groceries. $43. Gas. 25. Emma's medicine. $89. Total. 1,404. Income. 2 weeks. 891. Deficit. 530. March 17th. Electricity. Partial payment. 60 cents. Groceries. 38. School supplies. 12. Medical bill payment. $50. Total. 167. Income. 2 weeks. 836. After rent deficit, $343 remaining. The entries continued, page after page. A ledger of survival measured in dollars and cents that never added up favorably. She read her own handwriting from 3 years ago, saw the places where the pen had pressed harder, where frustration or fear had manifested as physical force against paper. April 22nd, Emma's birthday. Cake mix, $3. Candles, $2. Card, from dollar store, $1. Kept lights off most of day to save electricity. She didn't notice. She thought the candles made it special. Total spent, $6. Worth it. Sarah felt tears on her face before she realized she was crying. Not from sadness exactly, but from the sharp contrast between that life and this one. She remembered that birthday, remembered Emma's face in the candlelight, the way her daughter had made a wish with such seriousness, eyes squeezed shut, believing that wishing could change things. It had. Just not the way either of them had imagined. She took the notebook with her when she left, adding it to the small collection of artifacts from her former life, not as reminder of suffering, but as evidence of resilience. Those calculations, that desperate arithmetic, had been a kind of mathematics she'd mastered because she'd had no choice. That skill hadn't become irrelevant with wealth. It had become the foundation of gratitude. The following week, Sarah received a call from Sheriff Cole. His voice carried the careful neutrality of law enforcement, delivering news that might be unwelcome. "Ms. Mitchell, I thought you'd want to know. Derek Paulson was arrested yesterday. Breaking and entering, attempted theft. Third offense, so he's looking at serious time." Sarah remembered Derek's face in the factory basement. The way he'd smiled without warmth, the threat implicit in his presence. What did he try to steal? Tools from a construction site, maybe $300 worth of equipment. The property owner pressed charges. Cole paused. "When we arrested him, he was drunk. Started talking about the factory, about how he'd had his hands on millions, and let some city woman scare him off with a bluff. He's been telling that story around town for years, but never this bitter about it. He didn't let me scare him off. He made a choice to leave. I know that. But he's convinced himself otherwise. Convinced himself he was robbed of a fortune that should have been his because he found it first." Another pause. "Thought you should know, in case he contacts you. He won't, not from jail, but after he's released. He might have ideas about compensation." Sarah thanked him and ended the call. She felt pity more than anger. Derek had been feet away from wealth that would have transformed his life, and he'd walked away because trespassing on someone else's property didn't give him rights to what he found there. That was the difference between discovery and theft, between inheritance and larceny. He would never understand it. That afternoon, Sarah drove to the county jail. It took 3 attempts to convince the staff she actually wanted to see Derek Paulson, that she wasn't there by mistake or under duress. When she was finally admitted to the visiting area, Derek appeared behind the glass partition, looking harder than she remembered, prison having already begun its work of wearing him down. He picked up the phone on his side, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally settling on defensive hostility. "Come to gloat?" "No. I came to offer you something. I don't want your charity. It's not charity. It's a job." Sarah kept her voice level, calm. "When you're released, if you want it, my foundation is funding a restoration project in Riverside Mills. We need workers, people who know the area, who understand old buildings. The pay is $25 an hour, full benefits, with opportunities for advancement if you're reliable." Derek stared at her through the glass, suspicion written across every feature. "Why would you help me?" "Because you made a choice that day in the factory. You could have hurt me, could have stolen what you found and disappeared. You walked away instead." "That's worth something. I walked away because I thought you were lying about having backup. And when you realized I was alone, when you heard later that I'd been bluffing, you still didn't come back. You could have. The building wasn't secured for another 18 hours, but you didn't." Derek's jaw tightened. "What's the catch?" "No catch. Show up, work hard, stay clean. Those are the requirements." Sarah stood, preparing to leave. "The offer stands for 6 months after your release. After that, the position will be filled by someone else." She left before he could respond, knowing that his pride would require time to process the offer, to decide whether accepting it was acknowledgement of failure or a kind of redemption. She didn't care which interpretation he chose. She'd extended the opportunity. What he did with it was his responsibility. Emma's 9th birthday arrived in September, and Sarah organized a party that was everything her daughter wanted. A pool party at their home, with friends from school and the neighborhood, pizza, cake, and a pile of presents that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. She watched Emma swim with her friends, heard her daughter's laughter echo across the water, and felt the profound relief of witnessing uncomplicated childhood joy. Later, after the party wound down and friends had been picked up by parents who no longer looked at Sarah with quite so much curiosity, Emma found her mother sitting on the back porch. "Mama, can I ask you something?" "Always. Do you remember the birthday when we had cake mix and you kept the lights off?" Sarah's breath caught. "You remember that?" "I remember all of them. The scared ones." Emma sat beside her mother, their shoulders touching. "I remember when you cried in the bathroom because you thought I couldn't hear. I remember when we ate crackers for dinner and you said it was a special picnic. I remember being afraid of the dark because it meant we couldn't afford electricity. Baby, I'm so sorry you remember those things. Don't be sorry. I'm glad I remember." Emma's voice was serious, older than 9. "Because I also remember you never giving up. You worked so hard, Mama. You protected me even when you were scared. That's what I remember most." Sarah pulled her daughter close, feeling the solid reality of her, this child who'd witnessed poverty's grinding pressure and had somehow emerged with empathy rather than bitterness. "You're going to do amazing things with your life. I'm going to help people like you do, people who are scared like we were. I believe you will." They sat together as evening settled over the yard, the pool's surface reflecting the sky's changing colors. This was wealth's real gift, Sarah thought, not the house or the security, though those mattered enormously. The real gift was time. Time to sit with her daughter without calculating how many hours of work she was losing. Time to watch sunsets without anxiety stealing her attention. Time to be present rather than perpetually planning for the next crisis. In October, the community center in Riverside Mills held its grand reopening. Sarah had funded a complete renovation, transforming the building from a crumbling relic into a modern facility, with a gymnasium, computer lab, art studio, and meeting spaces. She'd intentionally kept her involvement quiet, but word had leaked, as it always did. The mayor insisted on a ribbon-cutting ceremony, and Sarah reluctantly agreed to attend. She stood on the small stage while officials made speeches about community investment and public-private partnerships, words that felt disconnected from her actual motivation. When it was her turn to speak, she kept it brief. 3 years ago, I was working 60-hour weeks and still couldn't pay my bills. I understand what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. This center exists to be that place. Thank you." The applause was polite, tinged with the discomfort that always seemed to accompany her public appearances. She would never be just another member of this community. The inheritance had marked her permanently as other, as someone whose wealth created distance even when she tried to bridge it. As she stepped off the stage, an elderly woman approached, moving slowly with a cane. Her face was weathered, carved by decades Sarah couldn't begin to count, and her eyes held the sharp assessment of someone who'd learned to judge character quickly. "You're Thomas Whitmore's niece." "I am. I worked at the factory, production line, 32 years. Your uncle was a good man. Tough, but fair. When the factory closed, he tried to get us all placed, spent his own money on job training programs." The woman's grip on her cane tightened. "Lost touch with him after that. Heard he'd moved away. Didn't know he'd left family. I barely knew him myself. I wish I had. He'd be proud of what you're doing. Not the money, though that helps, but the remembering. Most folks want to pretend poverty doesn't exist, especially when they've escaped it. You're not pretending." The woman moved away before Sarah could respond, leaving behind words that settled into her chest with unexpected weight. She'd spent 3 years learning how to be wealthy, how to manage assets and advisors, and the strange social dynamics of abundance. But she was still learning how to honor where she'd come from without being defined by it, how to help without condescension, how to remember without drowning in guilt. That night, alone in her office while Emma slept upstairs, Sarah drafted a letter to the foundation board. She'd been considering an idea for months, uncertain whether it was wise or indulgent. But the conversation with the elderly factory worker had crystallized something. "I propose we establish an emergency fund," she wrote. "No applications, no qualifying criteria. When we identify families in immediate crisis, eviction, medical emergency, utilities cutoff, we intervene directly. We pay what needs to be paid. We don't ask them to prove worthiness. We don't require gratitude. We simply help, the way I wish someone could have helped me when I was drowning." The board approved it unanimously. Within months, the emergency fund had quietly assisted 47 families, each intervention invisible, anonymous, requiring nothing in return. Sarah never met the people they helped, never knew their names. That was intentional. This wasn't about recognition or gratitude. It was about breaking the cycle of crisis, giving people room to breathe. On the 4th anniversary of finding the factory's hidden fortune, Sarah took Emma back to the building. It was the first time her daughter had returned since that initial discovery, and she walked through the restored spaces with wide eyes, trying to reconcile the clean, bright community center with her vague memories of decay and pigeons. "This was scary before," Emma said. "Now it's nice. Transformation can work on buildings and people," Sarah agreed. They descended to the basement archive, now accessible through proper stairs with handrails and lighting. The archive room's contents had been curated, displayed behind glass with explanatory placards. Emma studied the silver coins, the bearer bonds, the certificates that had funded their new life. "Mama, what would have happened if we hadn't found this?" Sarah considered lying, offering a gentle fiction about how they would have managed somehow. But Emma deserved honesty. "I don't know. We were very close to losing everything, closer than I let you see." "Were you going to give me to Aunt Jennifer?" The question struck Sarah like a physical blow. "What? No, baby. Never. I heard you on the phone once, before the factory. You were crying, talking about what was best for me, asking if Jennifer would take me for a while." Sarah knelt, bringing herself to eye level with her daughter. "I was exploring options for if I couldn't work because of illness or injury. I was trying to make sure you'd be safe no matter what happened to me. But I never, not once, wanted to give you up." "I know, but I was scared you might have to." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'm glad Uncle Thomas left us this, not because of the money, but because you don't have to be that scared anymore." They held each other in the archive room, surrounded by the physical evidence of salvation, and Sarah understood that Emma's memories of poverty would shape her just as profoundly as Sarah's own had. The difference was that Emma's memories included resolution, included the knowledge that desperate situations could transform, that hope deferred wasn't hope denied. As they climbed back to the main floor, Sarah's phone buzzed. A message from the foundation's director. "Derek Paulson started work today. Showed up early. Good attitude. Thought you'd want to know." Sarah smiled and pocketed the phone. Transformation worked on buildings and people, she'd told Emma. Sometimes it just required someone to believe that change was possible. To extend an opportunity even when past behavior suggested it might be wasted. Driving home through familiar streets that no longer carried the threat of financial ruin, Sarah thought about the person she'd been 4 years ago. That woman had been breaking, held together by will and desperation, calculating constantly, afraid always. She'd found a fortune by accident and inheritance, but she'd earned the right to keep it through persistence and courage. The factory had saved her, but she'd saved herself first by walking through that broken door, by descending into darkness, by refusing to accept that worthlessness was permanent just because everyone else had agreed it was true. Emma fell asleep on the drive home, exhausted by the day's emotions. Sarah carried her inside, tucked her into bed in a room that was warm, safe, and paid for. Then she stood in the doorway, as she often did, watching her daughter breathe, feeling gratitude that had somehow deepened rather than faded with time. Uncle Thomas had left her a fortune, but more than that, he'd left her proof that invisible people mattered, that struggles unseen by the comfortable world were still real and worthy of attention, that wealth had meaning only when it honored the dignity of those it served. Sarah had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. Now she got to spend her life teaching it to others, one family at a time, proving that transformation was always possible for those brave enough to look past surface failure, persistent enough to dig deeper, and hopeful enough to believe that beneath apparent ruin, miracles might wait with infinite patience. The factory stood in Riverside Mills, lights glowing warm in its windows, filled with people learning, creating, connecting. And in a house 40 miles away, a woman who'd found salvation beneath decay stood watching her daughter sleep, grateful for every moment of security, forever changed by having known its absence. She'd been broke. She'd been terrified. She'd been invisible. Now she was free, and she would never forget the difference. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.